Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, a new ERIN in southern seas, the dream of Colonel Robert Torrens. Another colonel, Colonel Light's plan for Adelaide, and the nomenclature applied to it by his fellow colonists encapsulates the theme for this address. Two streets divide North and South Adelaide into halves. King William Street is broader and longer, as is appropriate to commemorate the high Tory monarch of South Australia's founding years. Though shorter and narrower, O'Connell Street aptly refers to the liberal Irishman who was nicknamed King Dan. Between the two, never quite midway, and never quite at right angles to these streets, but meandering along between them, as if poised between British conservative and Irish radical postures, flows the River Torrens. In like manner, the Irish element in South Australian life from 1831 to 1841 does not emanate from the British or Irish extremes, but from a middle road, sometimes rigidly so, often ambiguous. There can, of course, be no denying England's primacy in the South Australian colonising process. But in an era when the intrusion on English public life by Irish men and Irish affairs was widely felt, not even the systematic colonisers who met in London's coffee houses could escape their influence. Their largely directionless proceedings soon came to be dominated by one such Irishman, and the theories which he had deduced in order to resolve what, in public policy jargon, was known as the Irish question. That man was Robert Torrens. The point of departure of much of his economic reasoning was the depressed and divided state of the Irish nation. Her speedy reform was his main motivation. But by framing his views with eulogies for all things British, while appearing to create the self-seeking means of his own enrichment, his credibility suffered in the eyes of nationalist Irishmen and ruling-class Britons alike. Thus, the judgment of history has not been kind. The Anglo-Irishman Torrens was an insensitive schemer whose blarney won him authority more easily than it covered his blunders, wrote one author, but not without having to admit that no founder left so clear a mark on the early settlement of South Australia. It is not really surprising that the British nation should have settled questions of colonisation at the same time as it deliberated over Irish matters. In a sense, Ireland was England's first colony, and her relationship with England, whether as sister kingdom or the unconquerable old woman of ERIN, was one of the dominant factors in every Westminster Parliament during the 19th century. And it is only logical that an Irishman born and bred, but of the class which identified most strongly with British interests and English ways, should make the cure of Ireland's ills the stepping stone to the remedy of the United Kingdom's problems, while spreading the empire too. Torrens' life story, though, has been badly garbled by writers on the subject, a situation exacerbated by the loss of essential records and the frequency with which the names Torrens, and Robert Torrens in particular, appear in the same sorts of documents relating to the same places and to similar career patterns. But as near as can be determined, Robert Torrens was born exactly 200 years ago, during the European winter of 1779 to 1780, at his clergyman grandfather's home near the town of Kilrea in County Derry. A not unusual mixture of fact and folklore tells that the Torrens ancestor was a Swedish count who served William of Orange as a captain of cavalry at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and afterwards settled in Ireland. More certainly, Torrenses were established in County Derry by the first decades of the 18th century, when 4 lines of descent may be traced. Each follows a similar pattern of education, marriage and occupation, but only the 3 senior lines achieved notable success, including high honours and knighthoods, by the 2nd and 3rd generations. The 4th line rose slowly in social prominence, thereby denying to its most ambitious product, our Robert Torrens, the full privileges of the Protestant ascendancy. Torrens' educations were commenced at Derry Diocesan School and continued, for the clergymen at least, at Trinity College, Dublin. Those who entered the other professions, arms, law or physic, secured their livings by patronage, purchase of commission or a network of family influence, blood and marital connection. None was a substantial landowner in the usual vein of Anglo-Irish families, but few made the system work for them. One, a prebend of St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, died worth nearly £10,000 in 1797. In another branch, 3 brothers were Archdeacon of Dublin, Judge of the Court of Common Pleas in Ireland, and Military Secretary to the Duke of Wellington throughout the Peninsular campaigns. Meanwhile, the 4th line had been founded by a Robert Torrens who struggled through Trinity College without much financial support from his family, worked as a classroom assistant in Derry until he could take up his first curacy, and then waited 17 long years for preferment. After siring a large family, he spent 2 years petitioning relatives, government and his bishop for a living, until at last he was presented to Harvey Hill Rectory in the parish of Tamlet O'Crilly near Kilrea in 1774. The extravagantly liberal bishop, after whom the rectory was named, also paid for its erection. He also favoured disestablishment of the Irish Church, emancipation of Catholics, and a host of other reforms, which he urged upon nationalist Irishmen, at the same time as they demanded reform of their own Irish Parliament. Of the Reverend Torrens' sons, only the last-born remained at home to care for him in old age. This was another Robert Torrens, who married Elizabeth Bristow, daughter of a neighbouring parson, the Venerable Prebend of Resharkin, and granddaughter of the Reverend William Grattan, a cousin of the statesman who secured to Ireland a brief period of legislative independence from 1782 until 1800. To this Robert and Elizabeth were born several children, including two sons, Robert and Andrew. Born in the rectory named after one patriot, and with the blood of another flowing in their veins, they must have infused some of their liberalism in their youth. However, the death of the old rector in 1790 and the outbreak of the French Revolution the previous year changed all their lives. They had to quit the comfort and financial security of Harvey Hill Rectory and its 360-acre glebe, and fall back on a small capital income, the bequest of a clergyman relative who died while young Robert was a toddler. The Revolution brought a change in British and Anglo-Irish attitudes too, from one of insisting upon personal rights to observing national duties. Thus, from the age of 10, while attending Derry Diocesan School, young Robert Torrens would hear of two loyalties, Great Britain and Ireland. But the question remained, what would he do? In a family of limited means, landowning and the higher professions were probably out of the question. But the wars with France provided an answer, and Robert Torrens' temperament determined the choice. In February 1796, aged barely 16, he joined the glamorous Marine Corps at little or no expense to his family. He was one of 300 second lieutenants enlisted during a 12-month recruitment drive. Less than 2 years later, he was promoted to first lieutenant, served in ocean convoys and in the Channel Fleet, and during 1801 and 2 was on the Cork station aboard HMS Glenmore. Late in 1801, after the Glenmore put into Cove of Cork from a cruise, Torrens entered into marriage articles with Charity Chute and married her soon afterwards. Marriage linked Torrens with Cork and Kerry families of great distinction, connected as they were to some of Munster's most influential landowners, in particular the Welsh Earls of Powys, whose representative maintained great state at the ancestral home Muckross House, on the shores of one of Killarney's lakes. In 1806, Torrens was promoted captain, and in 1810 appointed to the command of the naval gun station of Anholt, guarding the maritime approaches to Copenhagen. The following March, under cover of an early morning fog, a Danish force stormed the island, only to be repulsed by the gallantry of the Marine detachment under Torrens' command. He was wounded during the fray, but was awarded his majority by brevet for his bravery, as well as a sword of 100 guineas and another of 50 guineas from his officers and men. Returning to the island after several months' recuperative leave, he found that the naval commander of the island had punished Marines under naval rules. Torrens complained to his superiors. He was reprimanded by the naval commander, and then Torrens charged him to be tried before a court-martial. The Admiralty didn't convene the court for fear of alienating the services, but Torrens stubbornly refused to withdraw charges until adequately compensated. In any event, Torrens was posted to HMS Blenheim of 74 guns and spent the winter of 1813-14 cruising off the Scheldt and then in the Mediterranean. Peacetime saw him cooped up back at Woolwich Marine Barracks. As his military career wound down, another took a decided upturn. As early as 1808, he had written a confident pamphlet, The Economists Refuted, in which, among other things, he praised colonial trade at a time when Malthus and Mill led the field in condemning the possession of colonies as the cause only of war and oppression and an ineffective control on population pressures in the United Kingdom. Torrens countered, "In the actual state of knowledge and morals, there is no conceivable remedy except in a system of colonisation sufficiently extensive to relieve the mother country from superfluous numbers." In the same year, he wrote Thoughts on the Catholic Question by a Protestant of Ireland, in which he urged a candid and tolerant spirit in dealing with the Catholic problem, especially as two rebellions during the previous decade had put the use of Irish manpower in the British armed forces somewhat at risk. However, he did not suggest the abolition of tithes, still a son of the rectory in this respect. A light-hearted satirical novel about social manners followed, along with a treatise on money which led to the reform of the Bank of England 30 years later. An enlarged edition of Thoughts on the Catholic Question appeared in 1814 along with another novel, The Victim of Intolerance, or The Hermit of Killarney, a Catholic tale, purporting to be the text of a manuscript found in Muckross Abbey on the lakeside lands of Charity Torrens' relatives. It included elements of the Irishman's romantic attachment to his island's scenery, as well as providing a personal insight into the resort to emigration as a means of escaping bigotry and frustration, the pathos of the religious divide in Irish society, and evidence even of some knowledge of New Zealand's agricultural potential. His final wartime work was an analysis of the United Kingdom Corn Laws, which had important implications for Ireland. Thus, by the time peace was restored to Europe, and this is 20 years before South Australia was conceived, Torrens had laid down many of the ideas and attitudes which he would hold for a lifetime. They affirm that Ireland and her relationship with Britain was uppermost in his thoughts at the very outset of his economic career, that colonisation and emigration were an integral part of his thinking, but that his hopes for Ireland's happiness were conceived within the framework of the United Kingdom as a constitutional unit and the British Empire as an international agency of wealth and civilization. Torrens himself was rarely in Ireland during those years, although he visited the island often enough to produce 3 children, including a son named for both grandfathers, Robert and Richard. Late in 1816, he was there gathering information about poor relief schemes, having failed to convince the colonial secretary, in 2 memorials, that a political economist should be sent out as governor of New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land. As an application of ideas on the division of labour, a colonial appointment would have suited him admirably, and the rehabilitation and civilization which he promised of an expensive corner of the empire might have suited the colonial office. But it was not altruism or restlessness alone that drove him. It was in fact divorcing his wife of 15 years, a long and complex procedure involving an expensive suit not before Parliament but in the Irish ecclesiastical courts, and ultimately disconnecting him from his Irish gentry in-laws. Back in London in 1817, he presented his Paper on the Means of Reducing the Poor Rates and Affording Effectual and Permanent Relief to the Labouring Classes to the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Poor Laws. Again, he urged schemes of emigration as the only possible alternative for the introduction of poor laws into Ireland and to free capital and labour markets so that they might tend towards their optimum positions. Funding the schemes was also dealt with. Offer the persons capable of labour, who are chargeable upon their parishes, grants of colonial land, upon the condition that they shall, on arriving at their destination, give in return such a portion of their labour, or of the wages of their labour, as may be sufficient to replace the expenses incurred in sending them out. 1818 saw him fail to gain a Liberal seat in the Commons, in circumstances which led him to add his voice to the call for parliamentary reform. In 1819 he obtained the rank of Lieutenant Colonel by brevet, while still stationed formally at Woolwich and drawing full pay. In 1820 he married Esther Sarah Searle, daughter of a one-time Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies and a member of the Board of Trade. This marriage brought him into a circle of intellectuals, poets and writers, as well as linking him with a long-sought-after private fortune, and a devoted companion for the rest of his life. The new decade was crowned with success in 1821 when he was elected to the chair of the first meeting of the Political Economy Club, which he had co-founded with fellow signatories to the famous Merchants' Petition against the Corn Laws. The 20s, too, saw him building up an extensive ownership and shareholding in London newspapers, principally the Traveller from 1820 and the Globe, with which it was amalgamated in 1822. These and several other small papers which he influenced were so-called government journals, at the beck and call of successive Whig ministries and enjoying many privileges, including a guaranteed income, for fanning public opinion in any direction that their lordships might dictate. And income was important, for between 1823 and 1830 Torrens had been reduced to half pay. His political services to Lord Brougham and colleagues were rewarded with the Liberal seat for Ipswich, which he took up at the start of a new session in 1826. Despite advice from friends that he should hold his tongue if he hoped for advancement under the Whigs, he spoke his mind forthrightly over the next 2 months, perhaps because his election was being petitioned against and he foresaw an early end to a parliamentary career. His longest and most significant address took place on the 15th of February 1827, a few days before his disqualification and 153 years ago this evening, when he rose to urge the reappointment of the Select Committee on Emigration at the behest of Robert Wilmot Horton. Torrens' arguments were based on his earlier stated views about territorial divisions of labour, how founding colonies could achieve this, and how British power and influence could be spread throughout the world. In particular, he recommended emigration as the only means of resolving the chronic state of Irish overpopulation, and the drain on English wage levels caused by Irish seasonal migration to England for the harvest. Torrens calculated that 1/2 to 2/3 of the Irish rural population would have to be shifted to achieve the rationalisation of Irish agriculture and to allow the introduction of industrial concerns. Torrens' thinking on the subject of funding immigration systems had advanced since 1817 too. He now advocated the sale of colonial lands to yield a revenue, pointing to United States experience in this regard, and which he believed would apply equally well to Canada and New Holland. For example, 1 million people could be settled on 20 million Canadian acres with seed, stock and equipment provided. Land values would rise quickly to about £1 an acre. A rent of $1 an acre would see the whole debt repaid to the Treasury in 20 years. That was the kind of mathematical formula he would apply. In this debate, Torrens was not the leader, but he was no mere follower. His style betrayed his military background. It is possible to detect signs of the swordsman's parry and thrust, the manoeuvring of the battlefield strategist, the bravado and flourish of the brave defender of Anhalt, dodging flying rebuttals and charging with an hurrah for flag and empire. But the military metaphor also serves to explain the lack of much that is intensely practical about his speeches and pamphlets. Victory alone was the main purpose of battle. It was not for the professional fighter to have to foresee the terms of the post-war settlement. That was for diplomats. As Lord Lionel Robbins has written of Torrens, he was at his speculative best in debate, but he was unable to press on with general principles to the elaboration of a complete practical system. Indeed, that is precisely what happened to the South Australian project during his time. Success in principle, but not, at least temporarily, in practice. This augury of future failure stands despite Torrens' practical interests in Wilmot Horton's schemes of emigration from North Cork in 1823 and 25, Torrens' own participation in the Bay of Islands speculation of 1825, when the first New Zealand company was floated, and his expressed desire for a grant of land and then a government post at Swan River. Historians agree that the answers to the pragmatic side of the colonial problem were supplied by Edward Gibbon Wakefield, whose letter from Sydney appeared 2 years after Torrens' speech that I have just recounted. Economists concur in the judgment. Their leader, perhaps, Lord Robbins, has articulated the distinction between the two men. Wakefield concerned himself with reform of the colonies from within the colonies by a change in land sales policy. Torrens concentrated on reform of the United Kingdom by encouraging emigration from it. Torrens needed to pay for his schemes, and Wakefield provided the answers. But emigration from the United Kingdom, or immigration into the colonies, were only secondary features of the Wakefieldian dream for colonial renaissance. A proper combination of labour and capital in order to produce wealth and the basis for civilization were first, and in this he differed very little from Torrens. New evidence suggests that their positions were even closer than was thought previously. Torrens' 1816 memorials to the Colonial Secretary seeking a colonial governorship demonstrate that he had studied colonial lifestyles and economies, found them wanting, and recommended lines of reform. And an unpublished manuscript which came to light only in 1966 contains Torrens' explanation that many of his own theories, particularly those concerned with the origins of wages and other technical matters, had their root in his beliefs that only emigration would reduce the English poor rate and alleviate Irish distress. Torrens' handwritten tract, dated 1826, the year before his famous speech, and 3 years before Wakefield's letter from Sydney, is the missing link in his published reasoning on economic matters, and the emigration question, particularly. Thus, Wakefield still has the credit, in all eyes, for the land sales notion that was essential to an emigration scheme, but in effect, Torrens had the superior arguments for the rest of the equation. Torrens disputed a number of Wakefield's theories during the life of the National Colonisation Society, founded after the appearance of Wakefield's letter from Sydney. In fact, the society virtually disbanded in 1830 when Torrens and Horton resigned over a disagreement on the concentration principle. But more than a year later, Torrens rejoined, having been convinced that his own idea of division of labour was the same as Wakefield's point. A proposal for founding a colony on the southern coast of Australia was drawn up and presented to the Colonial Secretary, but rejected. Torrens interviewed the Colonial Secretary himself and reached a broad understanding about what would be acceptable to the ministry. But a new plan still demanded the impossible, appointment of a governor by the promoters, and was also rejected. Torrens' later conduct evidences his own desire for that very coveted position. Meanwhile, Torrens continued pamphleteering on the financial crisis, re-entered Parliament for Ashburton, and took a strong pro-reform stance throughout the session, even hinting at the abolition of the House of Lords and earning King William's wrath. From 1833 to 1835, he was member for Bolton, a working-class district. In debate, Torrens was often heard to urge schemes of emigration to the colonies, if colonies themselves were reformed according to his and the National Colonisation Society's ideals. But always, behind his remarks or submerged in them, was the rationale for his stand, the remedy of Ireland's ills. The outcome was the passage in August 1834 of the South Australia Act, to enable a Board of Commissioners to found the new colony, and as if to confirm that this was the idealistic phoenix of a new imperial age, the Palace of Westminster burned down soon after. And Colonel Torrens also resigned his commission at the same time, as well as his full pay privileges, to which he had returned in 1830, retaining only the courtesy title of Lieutenant Colonel, and in 1835 relinquished his seat in the Commons to devote himself to the South Australian experiment. It was as if, by the demolition of the palace, the Act was in progress and Torrens committed to it, finally. The ambiguities of the Act, especially as regards governmental matters, are well known. Also, but less known, its tone does very little to enable a favourable interpretation for Ireland, one of its most exclusionary provisions being the restriction of the use of the emigration fund to the emigration of poor persons from Great Britain or Ireland, which bears the literal meaning that the emigration should be from one or the other, but not both. Torrens himself seems to have recognised the distinction and characteristically ignored it. The regulations published by the Commissioners refrain from quoting that part of the Act verbatim, and refer always to Britain and Ireland, not the only instance of Torrens ignoring the letter of the law for what he determined to be its spirit. The Colonial Secretary at the time the Act was passed was Thomas Spring Rice, a great Limerick landowner, and soon to be ennobled as Baron Monteagle. He was keenly interested in migration as an immediate cure for distress in Ireland, and assisted many of his tenants to go to Canada or Australia. He did what he could for Torrens and his colleagues, before being deposed. But Ireland and South Australia lost a powerful benefactor in Spring Rice. Ireland's and emigration's special needs paled into insignificance for his successors, the Tory Scots, Lord Aberdeen and Charles Grant, later Baron Glenelg. The Commissioner's regulations were advertised in the counties of the kingdoms by 13 agents in England, 4 in Scotland, and only 1 in Ireland, Thomas McGrath of Dublin, whose late appointment, 18 months after the regulations were promulgated, got Irish involvement off to a slow start. Meanwhile, a total of 46 agents had been appointed for England, 12 for Scotland, and 4 for Ireland, 1 in the Ulster town of Dungannon, the other 3 all within 60 miles of each other in southern Munster, one of them being Torrens' relative by marriage, Arthur Chute of Tralee. In late 1835, Nathaniel Alexander Knox paid £250 for the purchase of land orders for 1,620 acres. Early in 1836, George Strickland Kingston bought a land order for 135 acres. But these are the only Irish land purchases under the regulations of those 2 years, and Kingston's transaction is a less an example of Irish interest in the settlement as the South Australian officer's duty to invest in her colonial lands. And while Irish land agents were too few and apparently too inactive to be effective, and only 1 an emigration agent as well, partly explains the lack of Irish emigrant applications during those years. The form filling and reference requirements under those regulations might have caused many an Irishman to flinch. The process assumed an ability to read and write in English, which raises the questions both of Irish labouring class literacy generally, but fluency with the English language as well. It is mooted that barely half of the native Irish spoke English by the early 1840s. A physician's certificate for many country dwellers would have proven difficult, mistrusted government dispensaries being the only source to a medical practitioner, and they were few and far between in the countryside. Seeking the assistance from a landlord in an already difficult environment for tenants was often taken as notice to quit, or assistance was simply refused. Protestant clergymen and magistrates, whose references had to be obtained, condemned emigration from their pulpits and benches. The role of the Catholic priest as a deterrent or promoter of poor relief schemes is also difficult to assess. In post-emancipation times, Irish Catholic leaders, from the priests to the bishops and Daniel O'Connell, clearly preferred reform of the United Kingdom from within to emigration from it. Having conducted the emancipation and shortly to conduct the repeal agitations, political support and funds from the masses were needed for the further conduct of the Catholic and nationalist Irish causes. The Irish Catholic poor preferred to remain at home in any event. One Tory newspaper put it this way: "With his miserable income and his church teaching him to cling to the land of his birth, with a romantic and superstitious attachment, the Catholic looks to the restoration of forfeited estates and believes that he will yet be in possession of the country. Consequently, he does not respond to the open sluice gates of emigration with 1/10 of the alacrity of his Protestant countrymen." On the other hand, the Loyalist and Tory Irish press preferred to protect an important aspect of the ascendancy power base, the Protestant working class and yeomanry, by demanding that lower-class Protestants remain at home. The Wexford Conservative was probably the most liberal of them all, lamenting that Protestants should wish to leave, but admitting that persecution, especially in the Popish districts, meant that Protestant life and limb were not safe from outrages and attacks. Thus, the colony which was to have been such a haven for freedom of religious worship was denied to both Catholic and Protestant Irishmen. There remained the problem of travelling to the port of departure. Ireland was well served by a passenger-carrying canal system and by frequent coastal shipping, especially from Belfast to Glasgow and from Dublin to Liverpool. Internal coaches were also available. But apart from the expense of these modes of transport, they were slow, often requiring food and accommodation on the way, as well as lodgings at the port while the sailing date was awaited. Liverpool and London were notorious crime spots, as were the other ports. Unsuspecting emigrants were easy prey to big city sharks. Naval officers had been appointed to many of these ports, including several Irish ports, after 1834, and policed fairly efficiently the conditions under which emigrants were dispatched to the colonies. Even so, intimidation at the point of departure was only one obstacle. Others were the length of the voyage itself and the shipboard conditions. 3 weeks to the Americas, as against 4 months to the Australias, meant emigrants would be out of work 5 times longer by choosing Australia. In practice, if an Irishman could raise £5 for the passage to London, or pay for his own children, as was often the case under the Commissioner's rules, then he could pay his own way to North America, arrive there sooner, and be met perhaps by relatives or friends, as the Americas had long been a beacon for Irish emigration. The Commissioner's contractual power to raise food, shipboard accommodation, standards and shipping regulations generally, was used to great effect, but even they had to cut costs somewhere. Departures had to be from ports nearest to the bulk of the emigrants. Instances occurred of emigrants from outlying regions, and in Ireland, receiving travel allowances from the Commissioners, as well as from private benefactors and the Irish government at Dublin Castle, but they are the exception. Nevertheless, at least a dozen departures from Scottish ports occurred prior to the 1840 season, but none was made from Ireland. The result was that during 1835 and 36, the commissioners received only 3 applications for assisted passage from persons having Irish addresses. All 3 were refused in any event, out of a total of about 850 applications from England and Scotland, involving more than 1,700 men, women and children. The only significant Irish intervention to the South Australian project in those years was the South Australian Protestant Emigration Community, formed in Dublin at the beginning of January 1837, in conjunction with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Its advertisements were addressed to those who wished to retire to the comparative comfort from strife and agitation and impending disaster which hang over this beautiful but ill-fated island. Only Protestant conservatives might apply, only emigrants might become shareholders, strict reference requirements were introduced, departure from an Irish port was promised, and a surgeon and chaplain would accompany the ship. South Australia offered a genial climate and a champagne soil ready for cultivation. The commissioners had placed the advantages of their admirable regulations at the community's disposal, leaving emigrants free of any expense whatever. 12 months' provisions were to be supplied to cover the period of settling in. Shares started at £20. The attraction which the promoters held out was settlement in a community with persons of the same religion and cultural heritage, as well as a combined purchasing power such as none of its members individually would ever be able to muster. In June 1837, its gentlemen investors voted on the motion of a Presbyterian, supported by an independent, that all subscribers should become communicating members of the Church of Ireland, and never to countenance or assist in the new colony any other religion. However, by September it was clear that shares had not been paid up and that trouble was brewing. A London departure with passengers recruited from other than Ireland was projected for early October, and a 166-ton tender was being fitted out to convey passengers from Dublin. After a 2-month silence, however, the next news of the community is to be had in the Commissioner's letter to one of the community's members, commiserating over the community's collapse and apologising for an inability to assist. The Commissioners did not intend an Irish departure in 1837 or 38, and the next 2 London departures were already filled up with landowners and their labourers. As many of the former members were tradesmen, they could not send out their servants free of charge, and their tools would have to be included in their half-ton baggage allowance. A minimum of £50 must have been lost by most families, some lost perhaps 200 or 300. Many lost hope, but most had to cut their losses and emigrate on the Commissioner's terms. Exemptions were made for a few, but age and occupation requirements were otherwise strictly enforced. Many waited over a year more for a departure to be finalised. Of 49 who applied hurriedly to the Commissioners in 1837, only 35 received embarkation orders. The Commissioner's policy was itself ambiguous. John Hutt told a Scottish agent not to send in any but agricultural labourers under 30 years of age, when Irish townsmen who were older received passages. To the Dungannon agent, Hutt stated that the Commissioners declined taking any large number of persons from Ireland until such time as they may provide a ship to convey passengers specially from that country. But the problem was probably more deeply rooted than that. The Glasgow representative was told peremptorily, "We do not want Western Celtic Highlanders, they are bad colonists." Still, a sprinkling of them would not be regretted if you could get no better. This attitude raises the ugly implications of the so-called Scots Enlightenment policy, proposed at the same time Torrens was being accused of shovelling out paupers by his immigration schemes, that civilization would best be served by the wholesale extermination of the Gaelic race. Scots, Crofters and Highlanders fared little better than this attitude suggests in succeeding generations, and the Irish poor did not fall outside its scope. The famine would prove that. Nevertheless, gentlemen still applied for passages for themselves, their families and servants. C.B. Newenham from Dublin and Kildare was promised a ship would call at Plymouth or Liverpool to assist his departure, because of the size of his party and the quantity of his freight. Solicitor Thomas Lucas inquired from his cottage in Armagh about the terms of land sales, and finally went out by the Surrey in 1838, on board which his sister met and later married John Rennell of Ranella. Newspaper reporting about the South Australian project was indeed light during the first 4 years, and probably contributed to a general lethargy amongst Irish for the new settlement. Even the Gazette notice, advising the appointment of the first commission, was printed in the fashionable items column, and then only of one Dublin paper. The departure of the Cygnet and the Coromandel in 1835 were noticed, but their destination was stated as being New South Australia. Perfectly accurate, really, but perhaps indicative of a degree of confusion over exactly where the colony was situated. Letters from Colonel Light and from passengers aboard the John Pierian Rapid were printed in 1837. South Australian packet ships were advertised, but only one departure was made, with a significant Irish contingent. The Orleana carried John Reed of Newry and his family, with several servants and labourers. Reed's father acted as agent for South Australian land sales from time to time. Governor Hindmarsh's land speculations, a profit of over 1,000% in 3 years, were reported at a Geographical Society meeting in December 1838. But meanwhile, All those subtractions aside, only 50 applications had been received for 1838. A third had come from Ulster and were almost completely rejected. 10 out of 11 applications from Dublin and Enverons were successful. The slowness, Captain Sturt's return from the Darling River and Lake Alexandrina expedition, reporting unfavourably on the countryside, reached Dublin early in 1839. The slowness and expense of the surveys met with some editorial comment too. If these facts may be relied on, the efficiency of the self-supporting principle of colonisation, about which so much boasting is paraded, will turn out, like other fine-drawn speculations of present times, a ridiculous absurdity, if not a mere peg to hang jobs on. That remark came at the end of a very busy week, one which had seen in Dublin a meeting of persons interested in the South Australian project particularly, and emigration generally. It was held at the Rotundo Rooms, chaired by the Lord Mayor of Dublin and addressed by Colonel Torrens and others, including Robert Richard Torrens, freshly graduated from Trinity College. Its purpose was to consider how far it might be practicable to extend to the self-supporting scheme to the relief of Irish poverty. The result was the formation of an Irish South Australian Association, an Irish South Australian Emigration Committee, to consist of all classes and to establish an Irish settlement in South Australia. Boards of guardians of poorhouses were invited to invest in land and send out their inmates. The meeting promised departures from Irish ports. This was no publicity stunt by Torrens. Rather, it was the climax of all his efforts in the immigration field. In 1835, he had published The Colonisation of South Australia, dedicated to the Irishman Spring Rice. It was a general theoretical statement of the principles upon which immigration schemes might be conducted, as well as an answer to criticisms of the South Australian project. 2 years later, he published a letter to Lord John Russell on the ministerial measure for establishing poor laws in Ireland, which by that time had become a fait accompli. He argued that the introduction of English-style poor laws into Ireland would only be a further drain on the resources of landowners, preventing the advance of Irish agriculture. That distress would not be alleviated by poor laws, at least in the short term, in which case auxiliary means of poor relief would still be necessary, that is, emigration from Ireland to South Australia understood. In 1838 he put his ideas into a practical form with the pamphlet Plan of an Association in Aid of the Irish Poor Law, the association being the Irish South Australian Emigration Company. Its motive was self-explanatory, its method to entice landowners to send out their younger sons with labourers from overpopulated estates, to establish Irish communities, or small farmers to sell up and go out to work small holdings. Towns and roads would be built in advance, stock, seeds and equipment would be available on time payment. The company would buy up land surrounding the settlement region at £1 per acre, but which would be made more valuable by virtue of the proximity of civilization and markets, and sell it at the profit. Then in 1839, Torrens released his pamphlet Emigration from Ireland to South Australia, which was usually distributed free of charge at meetings and emigration offices around the country. Thus, from a very early stage in the South Australian project, while the Irish were apparently being ignored as I've outlined, Colonel Torrens was laying the foundations for a scheme to implement not only his theories in general, but the particular purpose that had always been behind them. They had been conceived as early as 1817, after recognition of their necessity in 1808. The texts of these pamphlets differ only slightly from the published version of his speech to the Commons in 1827. The meeting in Dublin appointed Dr. John Bernard and Robert Richard Torrens as joint secretaries. Along with the enthusiastic landowners who had attended the meeting, they set off to advertise its proposals throughout Ireland. Whereas 49 applications had been received before the meeting with only 7 acceptances, 660 were received during the next 6 months, and 301 embarkation orders issued. Counties Cavan and Clare returned almost 2/3 of this total. Half of the applications came from Ulster counties, but only the poorest province, Connacht, sent in 105 applications, of which only 6 were successful. Clearly, the work of individuals like Bernard and Torrens Jr., as well as Captain Charles Bagot and other agents of private enterprise emigrationists following the Torrensian line, are the cause of this erratic pattern of applications and acceptances. But it is also clear that by its very nature, the scheme recommended itself not to the Catholic cottiers and agricultural workers, who were the majority of the Irish population and lived the precarious lifestyle of the potato-dependent tenants, but to Protestant small farmers and tradesmen and employees of certain estates. One of Robert Richard Torrens' duties was to address a meeting of his relatives and landed connections in Tralee, County Kerry, in December 1839. A branch society of the Irish South Australian Association was founded in the town, and much enthusiasm vented for their brilliant young countryman and a future South Australian Premier. But one newspaper thought young Torrens a fluent power at supposing many, very many things. So wary of his speculations was it. Young Torrens had spoken along the same lines as his father, but had added that he was going out himself. His credibility was further enhanced by his frankness. "Do not expect an El Dorado," he warned. Frugality and work are as necessary there as anywhere else. Some said to emigrants, "Go." He said, "Come," for he was making it the land of his adoption. He was happy to be the leader of a band of his fellow countrymen. Meanwhile, the Protestant Archbishop of Dublin, the Catholic Bishop of Waterford, Daniel O'Connell's brother, and many others had come out in support of the Irish South Australian scheme. William Smith O'Brien led the debate in the House of Commons in 1840, which evidenced a whole new outlook on the question, though all sides continued to regret that any departures at all were necessary. O'Brien had for a long time been a committee member of the Limerick Emigrants' Friend Society, as well as a member of the O'Connellite Irish Party. In 1851, he would migrate involuntarily to Port Arthur for his leading part in the rebellion of 1848. As a start to the process which Torrens had set in action, about 50 farmers and their families were sent by the appropriately named steamers Adelaide and Royal William from Dublin to London early in December 1839 to embark by the Morley for South Australia. The commissioners advertised in Ulster for a departure from Belfast in February 1840, but nothing appears to have come of it. The first actual departure of note was that of the William Nicol from Dunleary, then called Kingstown, in Dublin Bay, 8 miles south of the city, in early April 1840. She had come to Dublin by way of Greenock in Scotland, where passengers and freight had been taken on. 183 emigrants were in the steerage when she sailed. Next to leave was the Mary Dugdale in June, again from Dunleary, and, like the departure of the William Nicol, featured a visit of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland to the vessel a few hours before sailing. On each occasion, the emigrants rendered His Excellency an address of thanks, and he presented them with a supply of books for the continuing education of the children while shipboard. Aboard the Burman, which left in August, was Captain and Mrs. Baggett and their family, and 218 emigrants in the steerage. She had visited Greenock too, and then Dublin, and left the British Isles from Cork on the outward voyage, putting into Port Adelaide the same day as the Brightman, which carried Robert Richard Torrens himself. A storm of criticism was provoked by all these events of 1839-1840. Newspapers railed with a new vehemence against the depopulating systems, at absentee landlords, at Wilmot Horton, whom they called the Exterminator General, and Robert Torrens, who was dubbed the Irish Exterminator. They claimed that the virtuous and industrious were emigrating, not the immoral and lazy. Remove the cankers of society and society would be grateful, one editor claimed. Sharman Crawford's letters in support of the small farmer of Ireland tried to disprove that Ireland was overpopulated, arguing that it was her agricultural methods that were sluggish, and that there was vacant land which might still be settled. The Irish Waste Land Association, formed in 1836, had begun operating to noticeable effect by 1839. Its banker was a former South Australian commissioner. 2 of its directors sat on the South Australian Company's board. The company reclaimed bog and mountain lands, leasing the developed product to small farmers. The expense of emigration was another source for editorials. Each pound spent on colonial land to rob Ireland of another citizen could have been spent in Ireland to Ireland's own advantage. Not even the monies raised under the Poor Laws equalled the cost of the South Australian venture. Too many did not want to pay poor law levies, not enough supported private schemes, the majority were loath to sink capital into estate development. Tragically, the results of these attitudes only became visible a few years later during the famine. Some writers saw Irish living standards rising anyway, the country poised on the brink of a new social harmony. Others refused to interfere with price parity between the British and Irish islands. Whilst things are in this state, one said, of progressive amendment, to meddle with them is either empiricism or job. Torrens proceeded without concern for these lines of attack. He aimed to relieve distress, to release United Kingdom economies from economic strictures, and to diffuse socio-religious tensions in his native country. It may even be that he consciously strove to aid the emigration of poor Protestant Irish, who had for so long been the dupes of the Anglo-Irish campaign to maintain its own land-owning privileged position. His expressions of hope for the spread of the empire and for Britain's greatness, as well as the apparently fawning style of some of his letters and pamphlets, were no more than literary and essentially practical devices common in his day, and indulged in by all who sought to get on against the odds of middling birth, low income and lack of patronage, perhaps more so for a concerned Irishman in an environment of unconcerned Britons. There were, it is true, contradictions between his theories and his actions. When addressing the meeting in Dublin in 1839, only 3,000 souls had arrived in South Australia, yet he could still talk confidently of moving millions by his self-supporting principle. In all, about 15,000 went out during his chairmanship, of whom only 1,800 or so were Irishmen. What then of the boasted motivation to clear Ireland of its superfluous population? And a few boatloads under his private scheme was hardly a significant contribution in terms of numbers. Military background and the classical economist's over-delight in arithmetical examples led to too great an emphasis on mere numbers. One critic overstated the point, but struck on a grain of truth when he wrote, "Humanity was, by consent of the fighting parties, kept out of the field." No wonder someone suggested that Ireland would be better off by the emigration of 1,000 philosophers instead. Apart from numbers and the fact that the type of emigrant he sought and selected was not the type he had claimed should emigrate, Torrens miscalculated the depth of the religious divide in Ireland. He failed, too, to foresee the consequences of spiralling speculation and the abuse of the land and emigration funds. Land sales could not feed the fund forever, the system collapsed, emigration stopped, and a select committee appointed to lay the blame. Torrens avoided a direct hit, but was forced to resign. Although he admitted to a portion of the blame, historians have tended to light upon such self-interested actions as securing compensation for his loss of office as the source of his real motivation. His own land dealings provide a good basis for attack in this regard. But however improper it may have been for the commissioners to own lands in the colony they administered, his was not the frenzied speculation of other South Australians. The land which his agents selected near Adelaide adjoined that of like-minded Irishmen and became the first home of those boatloads of Irish emigrants which started arriving early in 1840. The distant country lands bought by the same men became the emigrants' permanent homes. Torrens' land had been taken in the names of John Wright, banker and former colonisation commissioner, and George Barnes, the commission's treasurer, and cost him about £1,000. In 1841 he explained to Lord John Russell that he intended to divest himself of this land, and shortly later told the Select Committee on South Australia that he was getting rid of it. It is not actually assigned, but it is equitably done. Those statements were technically true as a matter of law, and however devious they may have sounded, and however deviously they may have been interpreted to be, they are not grounds for dismissing Torrens as a charlatan, as has been done in several quarters. Rather, they constituted an expense which he can hardly have enjoyed losing, but more than that, they formed a special part of his Irish South Australian immigration project in which he was participating himself. Clearly then, Torrens deserves a better fate at the hands of Australian historians than he has received to date. He is well treated in English and Irish circles for his economic works and praised for his novel innovations. Unfortunately, the body of private papers so necessary to biography has not yet come to light. Those of his letters which are printed concerned business matters and his economic thinking long after the chairmanship of the South Australian Commission had ended, most notably in this group, the Overstone Papers. But they do not assist in the matter of his early life and career, both of which require further attention to determine more of the factors which made Torrens the man he became. As Lord Torrens has put it so aptly, the immortality of minor figures is always a very chancy matter. And if Torrens himself and the Irish question as it relates to South Australia needs attention, what then of the Irish community which grew up here, not only of emigrants, but even in the governing class? And so as a postscript to urging the further recognition of Robert Torrens, as a genuinely concerned proponent of emigration as a means of diffusing the potentially ever-explosive Irish question, it is worth a look at the sort of Irishman who came to South Australia even before he commenced his special pleading. In fact, large numbers of Irishmen, many from Munster, held official positions in local administrations between 1836 and 1840. Judge Sir John William Jeffcott came from County Kerry. His brother was Daniel O'Connell's brother's parliamentary agent. Robert Bernard's family came from Kerry but were settled in Dublin. Young Cotter was from Bantry in County Cork and first colonial surgeon. George Strickland Kingston, also from Cork, replaced Colonel Light as Surveyor General. C.B. Newnham, whom I've mentioned from Kildare, was a long-time sheriff. Robert Richard Torrens had been born near Cork and was collector of customs and progenitor of the Torrens Act, the Land Titles Act. Charles Beaumont Howard was the Dublin-born colonial chaplain, and his successor, James Farrell, was the son of a Longford cleric. Indeed, the Irish backgrounds of the latter demonstrate that the Church of England in South Australia was founded by clergymen trained for the Church of Ireland. The name of their alma mater, Trinity College, Dublin, appears to be repeated in the dedication of the first colonial church, Holy Trinity, on North Terrace. A later foundation over the river and on higher ground in North Adelaide might commemorate Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, also situated on a prominence overlooking a river, the Liffey. There is, of course, nothing intrinsically Irish in the name of Christ Church, or the dogma of the Trinity, and Howard was ordained to an English, not an Irish diocese, in the event. But it warns the inquirer into things British to be mindful of things Irish, even if they be of an Anglo-Irish caste and therefore liable to some ambiguity of race, temperament, or loyalty. And might it not be apt to think of the new British province of South Australia, as it was sometimes called in the 30s, as an Anglo-Irish province, at least during the time of Torrens' chairmanship of the Commission? Do you want me to show the slides now? Right, could you turn the machine on? These slides are a form of summary of what we've heard. This is the parish church of Dungiven in the middle of County Derry in Ireland, which is supposed to be the point of origin of the Torrens family in Ireland. The tombstone in front is in fact inscribed Torrens, but is of a very much later date. I can't say much about it. This, in fact, is Harvey Hill Rectory. Remove the porch and the top floor, and it's as it was in 1774. I was lucky enough to stay there overnight as a guest of the rector, who was able to explain a great deal of the history of his parish to me, as he was in fact writing such a thing himself. Just to demonstrate the size, status and extent of the estate, those are the carriage sheds. There was another building of similar size recently demolished for the horses. It was a very substantial estate, 360 acres, an annual income of about £1,000 from the lands worked by the parish alone, let alone income from leases and so forth. Right. That might be described as the Torrens outlook. It's taken from the drawing room window out to the glebe lands. The panes of glass are in fact 18th century, and one of them has the letter T engraved into it. So our colonisation commissioner might have been a vandal. Muckross Abbey on the shores of one of the lakes of Killarney featured prominently in one of Torrens' novels, which are by no means brilliant. They're not the Maria Edgeworth Castle Rack Rent type, but they make very good reading. And he wrote in the foreword to one of them that he'd composed many of its lines while walking midnight watches. So they are the result of, I suppose, a bored officer more than anything. Thanks. This obelisk in Phoenix Park contains has several bronzes on the base. And the next slide is of one of those bronzes, which is what I would like to discuss. The picture is allegorical. It gives me a chance to mention the Duke of Wellington, who, when asked, "Are you Irish, sir?" he replied, "Not everybody born in a stable is a horse." This is the statue of Daniel O'Connell in O'Connell Street in Dublin today. O'Connell represents the far extreme of the Irish view, the stay-at-home anti-immigration theme. However, he changed his view, as they all did. They had to during the course of the famine years when a great rush of immigration commenced. And he, of course, his name is attached to our O'Connell Street in North Adelaide. And this obelisk in the People's Park in the city of Limerick is an obelisk or statue erected in honour of Thomas Spring Rice, Baron Monteagle, a great landowner and a true liberal and a benefactor of his local people. There's a great number of letters in Dublin from emigrants writing back to this gentleman and his wife, thanking them for the few shillings, the few pounds to get to London or wherever to catch the ship to Australia or Canada. Only one from a South Australian, unfortunately. This extraordinary picture is in fact German printed in the 19th century. It symbolises a lot of really the emigration that followed the South Australian experiment rather than that which actually took place under it. We see here a man looking at the Shamrock line for passage to New York. New York is really the focal point of Irish thinking when you move away from Ireland. 85% of the Irish who left Ireland during the 19th century did go to the States or Canada. 15%, a mere trickle, came to Australia. This symbolises, though, the Irish peasant who fancies that he is really a dispossessed gentleman, hence the gentleman's clothes, yet in rags, and all the stage Irish nonsense of the shillelagh and so forth. And this is the pair. He's made his buck and he's coming home. This scene, a caricature of an Irish wake, invites the comment that for emigrants to the States and Canada, a function known as an American wake was held amongst Irish working class people, particularly rural people, and then particularly Catholics. The whole conception being that man is only a man once he's on his own soil. To go away, whether he's in fact alive and can return, there is a part of him dead. And so this scene of an actual morbid wake might have its parallel. I was not able to locate any record of such a thing as an Australian wake, but some of the descriptions of the American wakes were really a lot better than the descriptions of the morbid wakes. A farmhouse in Glengeshk, I show it principally because it is a fairly substantial farmhouse. 2 horses is a very wealthy farmhouse in 19th century Irish terms. It is from this sort of a house that the emigrant to South Australia under Torrens' era would have come, and indeed again later. The slightly stronger farmer, the person who had a few items to sell, he was not the absolutely destitute. And it was the lamentation of Torrens' schemes, and schemes like it, amongst the Tories, that it was the best farmers, those who were in fact the better experienced, who had the experience of larger properties, who were emigrating for better opportunities, and that it was the poorer who were used to their average, say, half-acre, one-acre plot, who were remaining behind, which was hardly the point of the exercise given the theorising. Thanks. Did that go in? Right. Townland. Green Irish pastures. Sorry. This is more like the region which was not affected by Torrens theorising. It's in fact in the Connemara, one of the harshest regions in Ireland. Most of those stone fences would have been put up after the period I've been discussing. Certainly the Cabine would have too. But you can see in the distance mere rock-covered hills. It was to such a region that Cromwell would have had the Irish go, and it is from such a region that until the famine, by virtue of their very difficult balance with nature, it was the famine which affected these people most, and it was these people who then tended to go for the mad rush to the United States. And again, for that reason, Australia sees fewer people from that side of the country. Irish Romanticism is probably one of the most powerful emotive forces in Irish history, I would have thought. This picture of the meeting of the waters at the Killarney Lakes is, of course, immortalised by, amongst others, Thomas More, and is the sort of notion conjured up amongst the Irish, regardless of whether they were on the most barren piece of potato bog, that this was Ireland to the Irish, and it still is, most profoundly. Thank you. Sunset over the Great Blaskets. The notion that one should see one's sun setting for oneself for the last time was also quite powerful. The island on the left is owned by the present Irish Prime Minister, if you're interested. This highly satirical drawing shows a number of things. The absentee landlords were attacked by even Torrens. He would not have approved. Here the absentee is enjoying some form of courtly love. Vesuvius or somewhere is pounding out through the window, and the spectre of the starving Irish is hanging over the scene. Quite typical of the printmaking of that period. This takes us out of Dublin to London. In one of those rooms, I'm afraid I didn't have time to find out which one, the South Australian colonisers sat. It's in Lincoln's Inn Fields. They were there for a time. It's housing of a type which most of their offices and rooms would have been in. This is back in Dublin, the lying-in hospital, one of the first in Europe, but the round room on the end is the rotundo rooms, something like White's rooms of important and hopefully not too recent memory, in which Torrens held the meeting in 1839 to get his private scheme for South Australian emigration off the ground. And this is Mount Street Upper. It is identical to Mount Street Lower, which has in fact been demolished. It was built as a streetscape, and in Mount Street Lower, John Bernard held office, his South Australian Emigration Office. His cousin was Robert Bernard, the Advocate General, here for some time. Two of Robert Bernard's brothers followed him out, one into the law, one all to die young, all of tuberculosis. But it was from such a genteel Regency streetscape as this that class mixed and theorised, and in fact I think ultimately missed the point from the humanity angle. Thank you. One of the buildings facing the viceregal apartments in Dublin Castle's upper courtyard, this is the Chief Secretary's office, which was in fact the address for all correspondence concerned with Irish migration. Even a letter addressed to the South Australian Commissioners had to go through this department. It was there vetted, and various political value judgments were applied to applications before they were even sent on. I suspect too, I don't know, there's something of a touch of the Adelaide Town Hall about that shape and design. The city of Dublin, and indeed the whole of Ireland, is well served by canals. This is part of the canal that rings the city, and indeed such a canal system we should have had between the port and Adelaide, of course. But it was used by immigrants, I know, from Limerick to get to Dublin, partly up the Shannon and partly along the Grand Canal, the Royal Canal. Thanks. This is a watercolour of the train line from Dublin City down to Dunleary, then known as Kingstown. Apart from the fact that I used to live there, the train is of the period of the train in which the Lord Lieutenant would have travelled to say farewell to those two emigrant ships. The next picture will be of Dunleary, I think, itself. The ships that would have put out in early morning might have seen that, as indeed I did, leaving Ireland. And that would have been, for the Irishman, the equivalent of that very famous English watercolour of migrants leaving home and having a blank look on their face. And the next one is similarly. The last view of Ireland would be the Wicklow Mountains, and the pointed one, the Sugarloaf. That must have caused a bit of a wrench for however embittered an Irishman. And finally, this is Craven Hill in Torrens always called it Hyde Park, but his solicitor always called it Bayswater, which is a very interesting point of upward social mobility. Torrens, in fact, died in the other half of the double terrace that we see on the right of the picture. And this next one is, in fact, the gentleman himself seated. It's the only known picture, well, it's the only picture I know of, and it's the only picture that's known of in England, simply because they now have a copy of it. It's the old colonel seated, holding a book, spectacles in hand, and young Robert Richard standing. Robert Richard had returned to England in 1863, possibly late 62, seeking a colonial governorship, and met up with his father. The old boy then died within 12 months of this photograph being taken. So I'm not too sure what that tells us of what the man looked like, but that's that group anyway. Right.
You referred to the Church of Ireland, the Church of England. When I was working on George French Angus, I found that he was married in the Monkstown Parish Church near Dublin, according to the rites and ceremonies of the United Church of England and Ireland.
Right, so.
Would that be the title for it?
In fact, the state, the formal national religion, united under the Act of Union when the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland were united to become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801, and at the same time the churches were united. But they were governed separately, and they studied separately, and in fact, later in the piece, certain doctrinal differences did evolve. In any event, the Irish Church was disestablished at a later date. But I was perhaps overstating the point, but they were technically united, but each the Primate of all Ireland, the Archbishop of Armagh, might have followed the lead from Canterbury, but he was in fact a separate administrator and belongs to a separate stream of bishoprics.
I thought that was an excellent, very illuminating lecture from my sense there. And it throws light on a question that's always intrigued me. Adelaide's always seemed to suppress its Irish element, and I wondered why. Granted your dichotomy between the Anglo-Irish Protestant acceptable type and the Celtic Irish type, but we know all about the Cornish in South Australia. We certainly know all about the Germans in South Australia. But we hardly seem to know anything about the Irish. I gather from research that's been done by people in this room that there was a very strong community out at Clare, but this doesn't loom at all very much in earlier records. And then of course, but they presumably are Anglo-Irish, but the Celtic Irish, the Tiersmen, are completely suppressed. And recent research shows that there were a much livelier and more interesting element of them in the hills than we've accepted so far. Have you found in your research that there is an unspoken, discreet but inexorable anti-Catholic Irish prejudice?
There was. No, my research has been restricted to Irish sources so far.
You mentioned the vessel Brightman.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I wasn't paying attention to the preceding couple of sentences.
Simply that the Brightman arrived put into Port Adelaide the same day as one of the emigrant ships, and it happened to have Robert Richard Torrens on it.
Which day?
That was a question of coincidence.
And what day?
Sometime in 1840. I come from October 1840, correct. Is that right?
16th December.
Well,
December, Rodman, December, and it was privately chartered,
December, quite
and Government Gray was on it too.
oh, was it? That was George Moore. But I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for some more questions over supper, to which you were all invited. And I'd like to call on Mr. Gary Stafford to move back. Thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all say we've had a very enjoyable and interesting evening. Peter Moore has certainly given us a new insight into Robert Torrens, and I think he's once again given me, I let him speak before, this sort of feeling for the early immigrants who came out here, what they gave up coming from Ireland, what were their hopes, their aspirations when coming to South Australia. Talk about buying a pig in a poke. You're putting this money down, and within 2 years you might hear you're going to a passage on a ship. And after that, you might even have to travel to London to get that ship. I also found it rather interesting that wonderful phrase you had there, the Limerick Emigrants Friends Association.
That's quite managed, that.
Yes, it's quite a tongue twister, that one. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join with me once again in thanking Peter for